In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to build this, the best $1,200 gaming PC build I believe you can assemble right now. Perfect for 1440p gaming in all of the latest titles and high frame rate competitive gaming at 1080p too. This is a really powerful system filled with some great parts that won't break the bank. I'll be walking you guys through the part selection for this build, how to assemble it step by step from start to finish, and looking at detailed benchmark and performance figures later. Let's do this! The Cooler Master Cube 500 flat pack is a case that lets you do it yourself with support for full-size specs in a compact form factor. A highly adjustable design lets you build as you unbox, and it really is like nothing else. What's more, support for up to E80X motherboards, 360mm long GPUs, and a 280mm AIO up top make it super versatile for the latest components. Build it your way with the Cooler Master Cube 500, now available in black, white, and macaron. Check it out at the first links in the description below. To start things off, I think we need to rewind back a little bit to when I was first picking the parts for this system. I'm going to be using Newegg to pick the parts for this build. There's a couple of reasons for that. First, it lets us see pretty up-to-date pricing and availability. And second, it means if you're willing to shop around, you can save even more money over the config here. Let's start off with the CPU, and there's a few options here. From AMD, you've probably got the 7600 or 7600X as the two best bets. The 7600 comes in at $229. 6 cores, 12 threads, the clock speeds are okay, not amazing, while the 7600X is going to deliver us that extra clock speed that we want. You can see it's available here for, depending on where you get it, anywhere from $200 to $250. This one here comes in at $239, but I have seen it, especially in sales, as low as $200. I'm going to add that to the cart as I'm pretty confident that's the best option, but let's give Intel the benefit of the doubt, take a look at some of their options at this price point too. The 14600K is probably the closest competitor from Intel, but that's over $300, while the 13600K from last generation is still going to set us back $283. So Ryzen is still the best option. Intel might give you a bit more power, some more cores, but we don't really need it for a gaming PC build. Now that we've got a Ryzen processor, we know roughly what motherboard, RAM and SSD to pick up. I'm going to go for a B650 motherboard, as of course that gives us a bit of overclocking for the CPU and memory, but isn't nearly as costly as a high-end X670-9. Straight off the bat, there's a few good options. B650 Aorus Elite from GeekaWhat, I've used that before, pretty happy, but it's a bit expensive. And the same goes for the MSI plus Wi-Fi. 180 is a little bit on the higher end of what I feel a board like that is worth. ASRock typically come in with some really good value shouts at this sort of price point though. Their B650M Pro RS comes with or without Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi version will set you back another $20. It's a lot more simple, it's a lot more plain, but I actually think for what we need, it's going to be more than adequate. So let's go ahead and pop that in for just 100 and how much? $29.99. As far as RAM's concerned, we need 32GB of DDR5, and we basically want to filter by price low to high and pick up a kit with a decent CAS latency. I think it would be sensible at this point to use some of our filters to actually filter down a little bit better in terms of latencies and speeds. We definitely want a CAS latency of 31 to 40. CAS latency with DDR5 is actually more important than speed, really. And a kit that comes up time and time again is the T-Force Delta. $95 for the black or the white version. This particular kit is two 16GB DIMMs, CL40, a little bit on the high side, 5200 MHz, should do us well though for this system. Any gaming PC build, or just PC build for that fact, needs some storage too, so we can go ahead and eliminate this now. Now we want a 1TB Gen 4 NVMe drive for this build. Now of course, as far as different criteria goes, we want a drive that is PCIe Gen 4, so let's add those filters, with a capacity of between 1 and 1.9TB, and then we're going to search from price low to high and see what some of the cheaper options are. The Crucial P3 Plus is a drive I've had my eye on for a little while. It delivers around 5,000 megabytes a second, so 5GB on the read, and you can get drives all the way up to 4TB. The 1TB is 58, while the 2TB is going to come in at around 110, and the 4TB at 200. Really actually very reasonable considering the speed of the drive. You might have seen our recent video on good budget case options, and to be honest with you, I'm not even going to waste my time searching. I'm going to go and take a look at the Montech AIR 903, and there's a very simple reason for that. The AIR Sapphire 903 in white or black, with or without the fans, is just one of the best budget cases right now. You can pick the black one up for $65, but obviously we've gone for a white motherboard, some white RAM, so for an extra $4, you can pick up the 903 in white instead. So let's go ahead and pop that in too. Cooling for this build, we don't want to use the stock cooler. It's loud, it's obnoxious, it won't give us any overclocking headroom, and it will restrict the boost clock speeds. Instead, something budget like the DeepCool AK400 is going to be the best shout. This has become my go-to pick for a budget air cooler. It's a lot cheaper, say, than Cooler Master's Hyper 212 RGB that people seem to opt for time and time again, and has exceptional build quality. Plus the white version at $38 with an extra $6 off using Start Deep 6 at checkout is going to do absolutely fine, and that's going to give us as much money left as possible for everything else. GPU wise, Nvidia's only real choice around that $400 price point is the 4060 Ti. And if you ever heard the words 4060 Ti, you probably know that's not a card you want to buy. It not only performs poorly, but it's VRAM constrained. The 16 gig model is very expensive, so that leaves us looking at Team AMD. Now the 7800 XT would be an absolutely ace pick for this build, but as you can see, 7800 XT pricing has gone kind of crazy. It's become such a popular card that it's very hard to find GPUs in or around that $499 MSRP price point. In fact, on Newegg, there aren't any. Now a last gen option from AMD that could also be worth considering is the 6800 XT, but again, that's discontinued and no cheaper than the RX 7800 XT, while they're more budget cards like the 6750 XT, if I just pull a couple of those up, are underpowered for this build, really, in all honesty. That leaves us then with the 7700 XT, a card that's been overlooked, I would say, over the last little while, because the 7800 XT made more sense for a fairly modest jump in price point. And as you can see here, there are a lot more options that will more affordably fit within the budget of this build. GeekaWhat have got one for $439, not a bad card. There's also one from ASRock, Sapphire, XFX, all within the kind of price point that we want to confine to here. I've had particularly good experiences with the Sapphire card, though I've also seen good results from the GeekaWhat card too, and you can find our full review of both cards in the cards section now. Now, buying a power supply is a bit of a minefield, and you can very easily spend a lot of money here. Corsair 120, 100, Segotep, never heard of them, 89. Thermaltake Tough Power, that's a little bit more like it. The GF1 from Thermaltake's also pretty cheap. And let's see if Thermaltake can actually deliver here. A lot of good budget Thermaltake power supplies, and this BM3 is basically unbeatable. This one's semi-modular, meaning you only plug in the cables you need, but the motherboard and CPU cables can pre-run. But the real kicker with this power supply, if we take a closer look, is here. You get that 12-pin next-gen Gen 5 power cable. Now, obviously, we've got an AMD card, so it doesn't really matter, but it's nice to have that future-proofing available to us, and you might thank yourself picking up this power supply with that particular cable in years to come. Now then, how are we looking? I think we might be under budget. Yes, $51 under budget. Couple of areas you could improve. Motherboard, you could probably notch that up slightly. RAM and SSD are totally fine. Really, I suppose just the case choice if you wanted something a little bit different. Or of course, you could push more budget into the GPU. But I want this $1,200 build to be achievable, even with a few price shifts. And latest pricing and availability will be linked in the description below. So what are we waiting for? I'm gonna hit secure checkout, buy all these parts, and I'll rejoin you once they have arrived, hopefully in a few days' time. A few days have passed, and all of the bits I was missing have now arrived. And I've got to say, I'm pretty pleased with my part selection. The only slight mistake I made was I ordered the right RAM kit in the wrong colour. So the white kit is on the way, and I'll be able to swap that out a little bit later. The best port of call really for any build is to start off with the motherboard and install as many parts as you can out of the case while things are easy to access and a little bit less cumbersome. Now, the ASRock B650M Pro RS is a board I've heard loads about but never used. It's undeniably a pretty basic motherboard, but you get the AM5 socket, 4 DDR5 RAM DIMMs, plenty of room for M.2s with a big heatsink for one at the top that might run a bit hotter. The I/O is very basic but certainly sufficient, with a BIOS flashback button, really nice to see on a budget board. Display connections, a 10 gig USB-C and Type A, some USB 2 ports, and then some 5 gig Type A's and a 2.5 gig Ethernet. Audio ports are basic but present, no optical audio, no massive overclocking headroom for your CPU, for example, but we don't need that in a build that's a lot more budget focused. All we need to do here is pull up the arm on the socket, pull up the socket cover, and then just drop the processor in, lining up all the triangles. Really is pretty simple. Just be careful, make sure it's seated correctly, and pop the arm down back into place. The RAM is going to be the next item on the list, our T-Force Delta DDR5. Now, as I mentioned, this kit was supposed to be white, but I accidentally ordered the black stuff. I have headed to overclockers.co.uk, which I'll link down below, and ordered the right kit, and it should be here in about 3 hours' time. So for now, this stuff will have to do. I'll be using the 2nd and 4th RAM DIMM slots for this build. That is going to give us nice dual channel performance. It's going to look the business and of course provide some room for upgrades in the future. SSD is next. It's a drive I'm really particularly excited to try out actually. Crucial's P3 Plus. The capacity availability for this was the thing that pleasantly surprised me. I mean, a 4TB drive for like $200 is crackers. Top M.2 slot is going to work well for this. You need a teeny tiny screwdriver to get the small screws and the heat shield off. Drive goes underneath and the heat shield goes back on top. A little bit overkill for a drive of this size, but it doesn't hurt to have better cooling than we need. The final part to install on the motherboard is this, the AK400WH. Now, I've said it in so many videos recently, but DeepCool have just been so impressive in the last year or so and consistently delivered some really, really impressive products to the market. You can see as well why I love the aesthetic of this thing. It looks incredible. All of the heatsink is all this nice powder-coated white finish. You've got this really nice white and silver accenting at the top, and even a white included fan. The first step on a Ryzen config is to take off the included and pre-installed plastic brackets. Do keep them safe, as if you do decide to add a different cooler on later, you may find that actually these brackets come in not only handy, but completely necessary for the installation of a different type of cooler. Then, inside the cooler box, take this bag of orangey stoppers and silver screws, and pop each of the stoppers over the black backplate screw threads, which are poking through the rear of the motherboard. Then it's a case of taking the silver bracket from earlier and just adding this on top of the orange stoppers, and then taking those included screws from just a moment ago to fasten this bracket into place. A drop of thermal paste just to create a nice bond between the CPU and the cooler, and then finish things off by adding the cooler block on top of this installation. You'll notice here there's a couple of screw threads. We can actually just use a screwdriver to tighten these up, and once that's done, the cooler installation is mostly finished. Obviously, the fan does need to go back on, but we'll save that for a little bit later when the actual motherboard has been moved over into the case. Talking later in the build, I think we're at the point now where we can move on to the case choice for this system. And I have, of course, picked my favourite budget chassis of the year, the Montech AIR 903 Max. I'd sort of forgotten, when I all spec this up online, quite how big this case actually was. So I may end up linking some slightly smaller recommendations below, but let's see. Let's hold the faith for now and just see how the build looks as we go. Take all the panels off. I should mention that's what I'm doing now. Make the whole case much easier to deal with before laying the case down flat for, of course, the motherboard installation. Check that all the standoffs are looking okay, and then slide the motherboard into place. Now, get that rear I/O lined up and poking through first, and then from there on in, it should all be nice and easily aligned. 3 screws at the top, 3 along the middle, couple down the bottom. Once all those are tightened up, just give them one more going over to make sure they're really nice and in place, and then add that cooler fan back on at the end and run the cable out to the fan hub at the rear of the case. Oh God, hello. With that all said and done, the next thing to do is install the GPU. Now, I know that the 7700 XT hasn't necessarily been the most popular GPU since it launched, but in our performance testing of not only this card, but also this card with the Ryzen 5 7600X in this system, we found actually some quite impressive results. The first example of this is in Alan Wake 2. At 1440p high settings with FSR enabled and set to quality, the 7700 XT achieved just shy of 90 FPS on average. This is a really respectable result in what is undoubtedly a difficult to run AAA title, and of course one that's pretty popular at the moment. This pattern of good results gets better as we move through into Call of Duty's Warzone 3. Here at 1440p high settings with FSR once again enabled and set to quality, and the RX 7700 XT delivered 148 FPS on average, just shy then of that 150 mark. This allows for competitive gaming at 1440p, and of course if you drop the resolution down to 1080p, you'd be able to push that frame rate even further. Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3 was no surprise a similar set of results really. 1440p high settings with FSR enabled and once again set to the quality preset delivered a pretty good 178 FPS at 1440p. It just goes to show this card really should not be discounted, especially for its competitive pricing, while there were also areas where results perhaps could have been a little bit better. Starfield at 1440p high and the card struggled a bit more, only pulling in 68 FPS on average. average. This is still much more than you're going to find on even a next-gen console, and of course Starfield's been the victim of terrible software optimization, so it's not all the 7700 XT's fault. Hogwarts Legacy saw the results pick up a fair bit, up to nearly 100 FPS on average at 1440p high settings once again, while our next title, Fortnite, just for the fun of it at 1080p competitive, yielded some amazing results as you'd expect. 274 FPS on average to be precise. While this card doesn't certainly deliver quite the performance you'll see from a 7800 XT, it is going to save you $60 or $70 in the process. And unfortunately at this price point, Nvidia have got nothing to compete. Now you can get obviously loads of different 7700 XT designs. I quite like this Sapphire card. Price wise as well, it also looked pretty good and was fairly competitive, which is nice to see. I have used this case previously, so let me just have a look and see if these rear PCI slot covers are already in the right place. By the looks of things, you just need to move this top one down to the bottom to create our 2 free slots at the top for the 7700 XT. Push the PCIe retention latch down, slide the graphics card into place, bit of pressure, yes, nicely done, and then of course just a couple of screws to get it all secured down. Really is very, very simple indeed. All that then remains is to pop the power supply in, and I've also picked up some of my favourite cable extensions as well, just to fill the build out, and obviously keep with that white and black colour scheme. These are from Easy DIY Fab. You can get a full set for like $25, $30, so cheap. And as I say, we're pairing them up with our smart BM3. Really impressive that Thermaltake are able to deliver this much power supply and also this much value in one package. The motherboard and CPU cables are already pre-run, so it's just a case of adding in one for the GPU and then also a SATA power cable. No SATA drives in this build, but obviously we have got an RGB and a fan controller to plug in later. The power supply being black doesn't really matter as it's hidden away under the PSU shield at the bottom of the case. And then just 4 screws is all that's required to secure the PSU in and actually finish off the power supply installation. And with that, the build is pretty much done. All I need to do is wait for that new RAM to arrive later today, and then I can boot this thing up and see just how good it looks. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to get subscribed if you aren't already, and enjoy the awesome glam montage to finish things off.